Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the March meeting of the First Wednesday Club. It's 10 o'clock. The council house bells in Nottingham are ringing for anybody who knows it, and we're going to make a start. If everyone could just drop us a quick line back and say they can hear us, again, that will be fantastic. And we'll make a start. Thank you, Amy. You can hear us. Anybody else want to send a message through to say that they can hear us? John, thank you. Brilliant. So welcome one and all to everyone joining us today. Special welcome to people who are joining us for the first time. We've got two people with us today really helping us out. One is Dan Campbell, who is our head of branding at the Arctic Agency.
Hiya.
And Dan is going to help me produce today, make sure we're recording, get the recording out to everybody after this webinar, and field your questions. And it's really important that we get questions through.
Yeah, so I'm in the unfortunate position of if anything goes wrong, it's probably going to be my fault. So please be patient. And any questions you've got, just pop your comments in the chat box or use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and I'll just field them as and when relevant in the webinar.
And second person, I'm really grateful for giving up his time today, is the wonderful Neil Bage. Neil, say hello.
Good morning, everybody. The wonderful Neil Bage. I'm honoured.
I called you the mighty Neil Bage on Twitter last week, so I
prefer that.
You prefer mighty? I'll go with that for future reference. Right, I'll make a note. Neil, where are you today?
I'm on the overcast Isle of Wight, so I'm in my home office today. So I live on the Isle of Wight. Glorious sun for the last few days, but today's a little bit murky. So, but I'm still at home, catching up and joining this amazing webinar.
Fantastic. As I say, everyone, keep the questions coming through for Neil. Put them in the chat box. I'm happy to answer questions as well. And the first thing I want to do is just talk about what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about, today's all about communication and the relevancy of communication. We're going to start off talking a little bit about advocates and the importance of creating advocacy amongst your client bank. One of the ways of doing that is regular interactions. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about content and how it's the foundation for all interactions. 6 interactions, 6 touch points that you might not have thought of, or you did and were good habits that have now fallen away. And then after that, we're going to talk to Neil about developing relevancy. And never has it been more important to be relevant than right now, Neil.
I couldn't agree more with you, Phil. It's you know, when people are in a state of panic, I guess, you know, the messages that we deliver to people need to land with kind of a salience but with a greater degree of veracity and truth. So yeah, it's absolutely right. Now is the time that we need to be really conscious of the way that we communicate. Absolutely right.
And communication takes many different forms. But ultimately, we want to turn people into advocates for our business. And we talk a lot at the Arctic Agency about turning suspects into prospects, prospects into clients, clients into advocates. And suspects are people who know you, but you don't know them. And that might be someone who's been referred to you, has seen you on Biased or Vouched for, has Googled you, has walked past your office, has seen you post something on social media. But these are people who know you, but you don't know them. And your job is to try and turn them into prospects. And that often means being visible online and impressing online. And for us, someone becomes a prospective client or a prospect for short when they take a call to action. They pick up the phone, they send an inquiry form in, they send an email in, whatever it may be. But at that point, you're starting to interact with them. The job then is to turn the right ones into clients. That's the ones who are right for you and you're right for them. And clearly it's got to work on both sides. Unfortunately, a lot of firms we work with then seem to stop and don't take clients into advocates. And turning them to advocates is really important because it means that they'll provide testimonials. They'll take part in case studies. They'll sit in front of a video camera and explain why you're so good and how you changed their life and the benefits of financial planning. But perhaps most importantly, they'll refer you on to others as well. And we all know referrals are the best type of new inquiry. They have the highest conversion rate, they have the lowest cost of acquisition, they have an immediate need, otherwise why are they being referred on to you? And of course, when they've been referred on, they're pre-sold. They've already heard good things about you. So turning clients into advocates is hugely important. And one of the ways we can do that is to develop a program of regular interactions. And of course, interactions need to be relevant, which is why we've got Neil joining us today. But regular interactions with the clients show that you care. It deepens that relationship and aids client retention. Most planning firms we work with have got great client retention. But regular interactions, regular touch points do show that you care and deepens that relationship. It starts moving them from being a client into advocacy. It improves referral rates as you nudge clients and touch them with your brand. And it allows you to share your knowledge and add value. And never has that been more important than a time like right now. And we'll talk about that with Neil in a few minutes. And it shows you on the ball, as I say, reacting to events where necessary. What would be interesting, and perhaps we should have done this as a poll, but people can put on the chat now. What would be really interesting is just a yes or a no. Have you contacted clients over the past 7 days? Yes or no, with regards to the stock market volatility we saw last week. Be really interested to find that out. Dan can collect the results and we'll come back to that one in a minute. Little impromptu poll that Dan didn't know about.
We've got more yeses than nos coming in. I think so far we've got 6 yeses, 3 nos.
Okay, come back to that in a minute. Might be a bit useful for you in a bit, Dan. Sorry, Neil. Again, keep the questions coming in. The foundation for me for interactions, the foundation on which your interactions are built is the production of content. And for most people, content production means newsletters. And we produce newsletters for over 100 firms now. And we often get asked a few similar questions. First one being, should a newsletter be emailed or printed? Now, with the caveat that some people in your client bank may not have email addresses. The majority of people have email addresses now. The last stats I saw show that about 91% of people regularly use the internet, which would include email. And that actually rises with, there's a point above kind of 60, 65 where that rises. So we generally recommend email newsletters. They're trackable. You can see who's opening what. You can see what they're reading. You can see which is bounced. You can understand which type of articles are hitting home and which ones aren't. And a lot of people are surprised about the type of articles they read, their clients will read. For example, if we write lifestyle pieces or pieces about your business, they're generally more popular than financial planning. Write about premium bonds or national savings for a certain type of demographic, that's always a really popular article. And again, that comes back to relevancy, something we'll talk about with Neil in a bit. But for us, because they're trackable, because they're cheaper, and because they're more environmentally friendly, email wins out every time. And of course, if you get and put bespoke content onto your website and use the newsletter to push people to it, that in turn will have additional benefits in respect of SEO. And we want to push organic traffic to your website. People who have typed in your Google, or people have typed in a service-based search into Google, because they're the most engaged traffic. It's the most engaged traffic in terms of number of pages viewed on your website, the time they spend on your website. So with the caveat that unless you've got a really old client bank or a low penetration of email addresses, and even then you can do something about it, we would go for email newsletters over printed newsletters every time. In terms of the frequency, this is an interesting one. And again, just let's do a little straw poll. If you send newsletters, just in the chat box, could you send through whether you send them quarterly, weekly, or monthly? That will be really interesting. Just if you do send newsletters quarterly, weekly, or monthly, be really interested to understand. Then Dan can do a bit of a what have we got down? Monthly, quarterly. It's mostly monthly, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every other month.
Vast majority monthly.
Yeah. Our view is that quarterly is too infrequent. People have often forgotten that previous nudge they had with your brand. and they'll have received potentially other communications and exposure to other messages in the meantime. So for our view, quarterly is too infrequent. We have some clients who, the occasional client who sends a weekly newsletter. That's fine, providing you can remain relevant. And one of the issues people have with weekly newsletters is segmenting their database or producing enough content that there's something relevant to the recipient in each edition. So we like monthly. Monthly seems to work. It's getting good open rates monthly, 60, 70% open rates, depending on the makeup of the database. But monthly seems to work in our view. But of course, you've got to be consistent, both in terms of quality and how often you send it. If you, for example, our newsletter our blog goes 7:30 a.m. Every Friday morning, and is resent to people who haven't opened it 4 days later at 7:30 a.m. as well. And it develops that consistency of how often it's sent, and the consistency of quality, hopefully as well. Others can judge that, but it's so important to be consistent. So important to be relevant as well. If you're sending content out which isn't relevant to the recipient, your open rate's going to drop, your click-through rate's going to drop, unsubscribe rates will rise, and you're just not doing a very good job. It's so important that we've got to be consistent, be interesting as well, be useful, and be informative. But for us, newsletters where the content goes on the website, if it's bespoke and exclusive, that will encourage, and unique, I should say, that will encourage organic traffic coming through to the site. And then pushing it out to clients, prospects, professional connections. Build your database to make sure that as many people as possible receive the newsletter, and then monitor the results you get, and then send it, in our view, email newsletter monthly. But for me, that's the foundation of your interactions with clients. A few other things that we've built up a list, and we, as I say, encourage firms to consider other ways of interacting with clients to turn them into advocates. And Neil, I'm going to bring you in here for this one, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. Valuation reports and investment updates. Some clients will want them, some won't. For some, receiving those regular valuation investment updates is exactly what they want. For others, it's downright dangerous. And I'm sure, Neil, you've got some views on this one.
I have, and one of them is, so if you look at the MiFID 10% rule, for example, where we have to communicate with clients when their investments fall by 10%, one of the issues we have is it kind of triggers a whole raft of behavioral response. One, we're only talking about it in the sense of a loss. The rule doesn't say that we should communicate when their investments rise by 10%. The focus is always on the negative and never the positive. And as humans, we're hardwired to react more strongly to the negative than we are to the positive. So actually, in thinking we're doing the right thing by providing information to clients, in some of those people, it could actually have a detrimental effect. In others, it might have the desired effect, but in some, it could make them, or could send them into a state of, what the hell's going on here? What should I be worried? Should I be concerned? And then we're already in a back foot situation. So they work in some instances, they work, but in many they can have the wrong effect to what we desire.
So Neil, if you have to send a 10% drop letter, sounds as though you're recommending some other additional communication that might be more reassuring.
Yeah, I think there is, so there are some people who will see that letter and will just naturally worry, of course. So actually, I think that should be prefaced with an additional piece of communication, whether that's verbal or whether it's written, that just, that kind of highlights the fact that this is a requirement that we send this out to you. However, don't worry, your financial plan is still on track. Everything we talked about is still in place. This is just something that we have to do. So I think but sending those letters out kind of blank and assuming that the client will join the dots and make that leap themselves, it won't happen. So I think kind of sending something out in addition to the right people should hopefully calm their nerves.
Yeah, really good tip. If you've got to do it, put it in some context, which is going to calm the nerves of people who might get nervous because they've got it.
Exactly right.
Dan, I think we've got a question.
Yeah, so we've got a question from Ben come in. Ben asks, would you recommend a separate newsletter for professional connections?
Hey, Ben. Absolutely. I think professional connections, whether it's accountants or solicitors, will be looking to introduce their clients to you when they need your relevant expertise. And you could just send them your normal client newsletter, but I would much rather send a newsletter that was targeted at them. So, for example, and solicitors, for example, have got such diverse specialisms. Some will specialise in divorce, some family law, some around estate planning, etc., etc. So I would be sending them content, and it's back to that word again, which is relevant to them and their clients. Solicitors who are in the divorce space, you might have run a series of articles on the recent PAG report. You might have done stuff around IHT for people in the estate planning department. Whatever it is, it's got to be relevant. And we've got clients where we'll run the client newsletters, which go out to their clients and prospects, and then we'll run separate content to their accountants connections and separate content to their solicitor connections, so it can be relevant to the different markets, rather than just a bit of a cop-out and sending the client newsletter to the professional connections. And Dan, another one?
Yeah, so we've got a question in from Duncan, and Duncan asks, how do you build or acquire a relevant database to distribute this content to?
There's all sorts of ways of doing it, Duncan. I mean, obviously you've got clients and prospects, but we're seeing people build their databases through running lead magnet campaigns on Facebook primarily, but sometimes LinkedIn as well, where the suspect, I suppose, is given a piece of content, a really useful guide, infographic, whatever it is, in return for their email address. They're then nurtured through a series of email chain and also added to the newsletter database. So we've seen that work really, really well, where people are building up that database and almost future-proofing their marketing by collecting relevant data from people within their target audiences off lead magnets. So that's one of the key things that I would use, a lead magnet to build a database. Let's go back to these 6 interactions to turn clients into advocates. We've talked about valuations and investment updates. Random acts of kindness. This might sound fairly strange. And often I've found that firms get into good habits and then fall out of them. And we all love receiving a gift or something unexpected through the post. And those random acts of kindness are a great way of listening and developing those deeper relationships. Let's say, for example, you've given the client confidence that they're not going to run out of money and they can therefore have a big holiday each year, and they're off to Australia. Send them a travel guide. If someone has retired earlier than they thought they could do, or paid off their mortgage, then send them something through the post. Just it's these random things that were unexpected, which are relevant to them. And I do love the travel guide one. Because so often clients, not always, but so often, they first year or two into those years of active retirement, they go off and see the world. Gifts we tend to recommend, and I've seen firms use gifts to thank people for referrals as well. But we recommend they're sent to the client's place of work rather than sent home, simply because it's more practical, and also because whenever a parcel arrives in an office, I don't know if your office is the same, but we had some chocolate sent to us a couple of weeks ago by a really happy client, and it creates a bit of a buzz in the office, a bit of excitement. Some flowers turn up, people want to know who they're from. So sending those gifts to the place of work works really, really well as well. Next one, I was thinking of you messages. It sounds a little bit weird, but it's not. At different times of the day and with different triggers, clients will randomly pop into your head. And I would suggest using that as a cue to get in touch, just with how are things going. I had a call with an advisor last week. He'd had a really good couple of days, quick chat on the phone, and it clearly shows that I'm thinking of him, and I'm really keen to understand how he was doing. So those quick, I was thinking of you, how are you doing? I drove past your house, whatever it is, send them on email, send them on a direct message if you communicate with them on social media, pick up the phone to them. But those I was thinking of you messages work really, really well, as do the I saw this and thought of you messages. And it's a bit of an extension of the previous one. So you will know your clients have certain touch points, certain things they're interested in, certain things they've asked you about. And at different times, you'll come across things which may interest them in just general browsing, general day-to-day viewing of things. Send it to them. Send them stuff that's relevant to them. I saw this and thought of you. Again, it deepens relationships. It demonstrates that you're thinking of clients outside of the normal review cycle. And it really shows that you know them as well. And then we've got birthdays, Christmas, and special events. I'd always recommend sending cards on birthdays and special events. Christmas, down to you whether you do them for your clients or not, although not a big fan of corporate Christmas cards. But I've just cut some work out of Dan's branding team at Christmas now. But sending birthday cards, cards at special events. So they've retired, paid the mortgage off. That's a big deal for a lot of people, paying the mortgage off, not having any debt over them, and owning their house outright. That's a big deal. Do we actually mark this? Do you mark this as a special occasion with your clients on your back office system? Because all this can be processed. It's all about recording the dates and then making sure you do something with them. But make sure it's relevant and make sure it's personal. Handwritten cards, handwritten envelopes, stamp on there, sending it, that sort of stuff. But it's so important that we use as many of these interactions as we can, from your foundation of newsletters and content through to the valuations, investment updates you have to do, and those other one-off things, those random acts of kindness, that really personal stuff, through to cards at different occasions. So important that we use them, and if we do, we will turn clients into advocates. And the last one that I want to talk about, and this is why we've got Neil on today, is those one-off communications. An example of which is the potential 10% drop letter. So this is where I want to bring Neil into the conversation, unless we've got any more questions right now.
Yeah, we do. So just going back to cards and client communications, Stephanie asks, would you recommend postal cards rather than e-cards?
Absolutely. A nice card that is, let's say you thank someone for referral, birthday, Christmas. Remember the kids as well. So kids' birthdays, because if you've got long-standing relationships with these people, you will have seen their kids grow up. I remember a client of mine when I was advising. I remember seeing them before their daughter was born. She's now a teacher. That's how long those relationships last. So remember the children as well, and remember those big life events. But yes, I think a handwritten card that's been carefully chosen, that where the advisor's written the card, not an administrator, the advisor's written the envelope, you put a stamp on it, and you've gone to the effort of putting the post. I think that's far more personal, and will be far better received than sending something via Moonpig or an e-card or something like that.
Phil, can I just jump in here on this point?
Please.
This is a really there's a massive behavioral angle here, because over if you think about how humans have evolved, it's only really been in the last few seconds of human existence that the world of technology has taken over, and we've become much more digital in the way that we operate. But actually, we're really hardwired to interact with the world through touch and feel and our senses. So actually, there is a biological, a physiological benefit of actually touching something and seeing something with your own eyes and having it in your hand. I mean, this is a different debate between digital money and real money, but actually the theory is the same. The science is the same. If you send somebody something and they open the front door and they take it off the postman and it touches their hands, there is an immediate emotional attachment made to the item. It's called one of the behaviors that measure this is called the endowment effect, whereby if somebody owns something, they place more value on it than if they didn't own the same item. So actually sending something through the post and somebody having to open an envelope and touch something and read something that's been handwritten, which tells me that somebody's taken the time, we shouldn't underestimate the emotional value that that gives to the receiver, which is the same as your random act of kindness point. I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah,
It's actually a behavioural point.
It's a fascinating point, and I'm completely with you. I think that this demonstrates the value is greater than the card. It demonstrates that someone's taken the time, the effort to do it. But one point that Ian's raised, he says, I found so many people think a paper card is a sensitive issue with clients. The paper, the postage, the environmental impact. Does this come back to knowing your clients and knowing how to communicate with them?
And for me, the answer is absolutely yes, it does. You know, the know your client kind of conversation is much broader than what I talk about, which is the behavioral aspect of the client. It's about knowing, you know, which buttons to press and when to press them and when not to press them. So if you, in your conversation, the know your client process in financial services is typically been for years and years. I've been in this industry for 25 years now. And it's always been seen typically as a kind of tick box exercise. Let's ask these questions, get that done. But actually, I've always kind of had this view that it never really gets to know the client at all. Over the years of having relationships with them, you guys get to know the clients and you get to know what their views are of the world and how they navigate the world around them on a daily basis. And those things should absolutely be factoring into the way that you communicate with people. If Mary absolutely is a staunch environmentalist and believes that global warming is absolutely a serious threat and is all about carbon footprint, then you need to deal with Mary very differently than you would with John, who kind of has a similar view but isn't as strong in his opinions. So know your client is much deeper and broader than this industry would suggest it is through the processes that we currently have.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. And thank Ian for the question, because it's important to raise it. You could alienate a client who has concerns in that regard by sending them a paper card, and therefore will be better with an email card.
Yeah.
So this seems the appropriate time, Neil, to introduce yourself, if you would. We're halfway through, but just to talk to us about, you said you've been in the profession for over 20 years. If you could just talk about your background a little bit for the odd person that's not heard about you, and just talk about what BIQ does, if that's okay.
I will. You know, you shouldn't call any of your kind of listeners odd, right? But anyway.
I knew you were going to pick up on that.
So absolutely. So I've been in the industry for a while. Like many people, I guess, I kind of fell into the industry and started working in Southampton in financial services for a company that probably everybody will have heard of, who are no longer around. I started working for a company called Scandia. And I worked for them for 17 years and ended up as head of strategy at that company, where I was doing a huge amount of work into understanding how the end consumer interacts with us as a brand. I left there and set up a one-man consultancy and worked for a dozen other big financial services companies doing the same job. But everything I've ever done since I left school and started studying sports psychology and human biology has always been around understanding the human that's in front of us, the person that we're trying to help, but on a level that typically we can't do through questionnaires. And you know, I prefer to understand the psychological angle of who they are. And so I did consultancy for companies, and then decided, you know what, I want to do this properly. I want to try and help financial planners get inside of the heads of their customers and start revealing the real customer, the true self, if you like. So I set up BIQ, Behavioral IQ, 5 years ago now, and with a guy called Mike Free, and we together have spent the last 5 years researching how people make decisions, researching the psychology of decision making, looking at which behavioral biases have the biggest impact on financial decisions and therefore financial plans, and to a point where today we are in a position where we have two kind of complementary products that allow advisors and clients to learn more about themselves and how they make those important choices.
Thank you for that. And if anybody's got any questions for Neil, keep get them coming in, and we'll ask as we go through. But one thing I'm fascinated by is we've talked about it today in two, I suppose, really quite extreme examples, from investment updates at a period of volatility, and right the way through to the other end, whether someone might get alienated by receiving a card through the post. So from a behavioural perspective, why is it for you, Neil, so important that financial planners genuinely know their clients? With the emphasis on the word genuinely, I think.
Because, so as a human, we have, excuse me a second, as a human, we have kind of we live in two worlds. We live in a world that is the world as we see it. And that typically isn't wholly objective. It's very subjective. Because I see things through my eyes, I hear things through my ears, and taste and smell, all of these things. And the way that my brain, Neil Bage's brain, interprets that input is very different to the way that Phil Bray's brain will interpret that input. And therefore, that kind of subjective view, can have an impact of how it does have an impact how I interact with the world and make choices. What we need to do, so sorry, let me backtrack. If I'm therefore sitting with a client and asking them to make financial decisions, and I'm only taking their subjective view of the world into account, I am naturally missing a ton of valuable information. What I need to do is I need to dip into the objective reality. Now, the way that my brain interprets something is the way that I interpret it. The way that you, Phil, do is the way that you interpret it. But actually, the objective reality that sits around us is the objective reality. You know, the fact that the sky is blue is an objective. It's a fact. How you interpret that and how I interpret it might be different. So what we need to do from a financial planning perspective is bring into the equation as much objective reality as we possibly can. And the only way you can do that is by cutting through the subjective noise. And the only way you can do that is by getting inside the head of the person sitting in front of you. And the only way you can do that is by presenting them with a series of interactions that allow them to engage with you and reveal what's going on inside their head. And that is what we mean by know your client. And I think if you don't have that objective reality factored in, there is a really strong chance that every single time you engage with a customer, it's based on a subjective base point. And that could, and we see this through research, that does, it can unfold very, very quickly into not a good place. So
how can financial planners put that theory to practical use currently? Take the last 7 days or however long it's been.
Yep.
How can financial planners put that theory about objective reality to practical use and improve their client engagements right now?
The one thing we all need to do is, you know, we need to base our interactions on fact and on the evidence that is out there, and not the stories that we tell ourselves or we allow our clients to tell themselves. You know, all of your clients, every person is looking at what's going on in the world currently and is interpreting it in their own way. And, you know, one of the behavioral biases that is absolutely dominant at the moment, you can see it, is herding bias. You know, people are seeing stuff and they see what everybody else is doing and therefore just do that. And I'm not saying what's going on in the world at the moment isn't serious. It is. It absolutely is. But the objective reality of what's going on needs to be factored in, and not just the noise. So the way that we communicate with our clients, you know, it needs to be based off fact. It can't be based off anything that or an interpretation of data. It needs to be based on the data. So if, for example, and we know this, the news says $5 trillion was wiped off the stock market last week. That's fine. That's a fact. But actually what we need to do in interacting with our clients and communicating with them is put that into a context for them and tell them what that means for them. But actually, if we do contact them, it's only to reassure them that their financial plan, which is long-term, is still on track. Yes, we have these dips in markets. We have had since time immemorial, and the market will always recover. So kind of communicating to them based on the facts, educate them where they need to be educated into the fact that everything is still all right. Yes, it's a deep blip, but it's a blip nonetheless. And it will, time tells us, will recover at some point. But actually, I've gone back to that. My first point, communicating based on evidence-based communication just sets you up for proper adult conversations and allows people to come to terms with the reality and not the stories that they're telling themselves.
And I think that's, for us, that's really important, the difference between communication and education. For firms that, we've got a lot of firms who haven't wanted to send any communications out because their clients are well educated. They know the value of the plan. They know that market values fall and rise. And they've had that education piece probably over years. Some people will have had that education piece over years, but still be nervous right now. And
I would argue, Phil, actually, sorry, on this point, I would argue that every client, without exception, who sees that news article on the BBC, which was on Thursday night. I was sat in my parents' living room when that news headline was on the BBC News, and it's at the time it said $5 trillion wiped off global stock markets. I would argue, even if your clients are well educated in don't panic, the plan's the plan, blah blah blah. I think it's an evolutionary impossibility for them not to have a degree of emotional response to that. It may, they may go, oh no, my plan has told me not to worry, and that's where the education piece comes in and is realized. But I think for people to assume that just because every client has been educated not to panic means that they won't panic, goes against everything from an evolutionary perspective that we know.
Saying that, Neil, if I hear you right, is that even if clients are educated, there's still no harm in communicating with them to provide reassurance?
To a degree, Phil, yeah. So even if they're educated, what I'm saying is, say there was, let's use numbers, say there's 100 people in your firm and 100 people you have educated. Markets fall, markets rise. When markets fall, don't worry, I've got everything in hand. The plan is the plan, blah, blah, blah. What I'm saying is, in amongst that 100, when you get events, and we could call this a black swan, it's one of those 5% events where the market is absolutely pummeled by what's going on in the world. Of those 100, there may be 20 of them who absolutely still need you to pick up the phone and reassure them that everything is fine. The other 80 might be fine. And actually within the 20 you contact, there may be 10 who are absolutely petrified, who are sitting at home in proper emotional meltdown. So I'm saying that it's not as easy as saying I've educated 100 people and therefore let's just talk to 100. Ignore the 100. It's about knowing in that 100, who do you absolutely still need to lean forward and metaphorically hold their hand?
Neil, where were you?
Where was I? Someone give me a tip about where I was, because I was in a Neil Bage rant mode.
Well, actually, we've got a question for me and Elton that worked really quite well. Can we see the question from Neil, Dan? Neil was asking a question about the communicating to clients in different ways. Is it fair to say
yes,
that different clients will need different levels of reassurance?
Yes. So that's. Let me just say the point again, just in case it was missed, and if it wasn't, it's okay to reiterate anyway. What I was saying, Phil, to your question was, if you have 100 clients and you've educated them well, don't panic. Markets rise and fall. Your plan is your plan. It doesn't mean that when £5 trillion is wiped off the stock market, that in that 100, 10 of them may be sitting at home, or 20 may be sitting at home worrying. Of those 20, maybe 5 or 10 are sitting at home in proper emotional meltdown. So it's about knowing your client. It's about knowing that even though I've educated them, I still need to reach out metaphorically and grab the hand of 10 of these people and just say, everything's going to be all right. it's that's the depth of understanding in a know your client sense that I talk about. Yes, you can educate 100 people every day, say the same thing: don't panic, markets fall, markets rise, don't panic. It doesn't mean that the human, how we've developed as a species over 5 million years, which is to avoid losses and to kind of, absorb, to kind of take on board gains. It doesn't mean that we can turn that evolutionary switch off. That switch is firmly turned on in every one of us, and it's knowing who to speak to, when to speak to them, and what to speak to them about is what's important.
Okay, so assuming that we need this information about who to speak to, what to say, and how to say it before a event such as the past week comes along, what are the key ways for you of segmenting clients, of genuinely getting to know their clients? How can planners do this so that they are prepared with the right communications, which can be sent in the right way when the time comes to do it?
Now, so I'm going to preface my response here with, I would say this, wouldn't I? But actually, the only way that I can see this ever working, and this the reason why I set up BIQ, right, is through behavioral insight. Because if every reaction and action a human takes is based off a behavior, off a behavioral response. And I can't design, as a financial planner, a communication strategy without knowing how my clients are likely to react to given events. It's not possible for me to do that. I could segment people, as we typically have over the last 20 years, by wealth or by demographic profile or some other arbitrary measure. But actually, the only one in my view that matters is a segmentation based on behavioral propensities, which is to say, I have a group of people in my client bank and who I'm going to call, hesitant starters, whatever. I know that these people naturally, when it comes to a composure perspective, are much more hesitant in the way that they make decisions. And I know that they're only starting out in the financial journey, which comes as a double whammy. They haven't got the experience to kind of comfort themselves, and they are naturally hesitant people. Having a segment like that completely tells me how I should communicate with these people, the tone of the language I use with these people, what to send them, what not to send them, how to frame information, how not to frame information, what to anchor them to, what not to anchor them to. And if you contrast that with another group of people who may be kind of very calm pros, if we use that word, these are people who've been around the block, they know this stuff. This isn't, to use a terrible phrase, this isn't their first rodeo, right? So, and those people, that you communicate to them differently, your tone of language with them is different. What you send them is different because they have the behavioral ability to understand and take information as it is presented, compared to the first group who could take a piece of information and blow it all out of proportion based on the fact that it's framed or is anchoring them in a particular way. So to answer your question, long way about answering it, is for me, segmentation is crucial, but segmenting people by behavioral propensity tells us not only who I need to speak to at times like $5 trillion wiped off the stock market, but it tells me a whole raft of other things, like how do I speak to them? What do I send them? What don't I send to them? Everything I've just covered. So behavioral segmentation for me, Phil, is an absolute must in the way that financial planners look at their entire client base as a group of people. And
to segment by behavioural propensity, practically, what tools are available for firms to do it?
There's two answers to this. You can either try and do it yourself, and you can do it yourself by understanding behaviors and asking your own questions of people to see if they and trying to draw that out, but it's notoriously difficult, which is why we've kind of spent 5 years building the software that we've built, which allows people to, and when I say people, I kind of mean your customers, to go through a series of gamified tests, if you like, which reveal the strength or weakness of underlying behavioral biases. And actually, when you understand that, it allows you to create segmentation or segments based on behaviors. So if you know, for example, that, you know, I used my two clients from earlier. If you put Mary through the system and you know that she is, you know, she has high confirmation bias, she has, you know, high disposition effect, very loss averse, very present minded, she would sit in a different segment to John, who actually has the complete opposite behaviors, and how you talk to those two people is very different. So that at the moment you can either do it yourself. It's a crude way of doing it and unscientific. But we've, you know, the last 5 years of our life, we've spent building something that allows advisors and their clients to do exactly this. It's to go through a systemized, engaging, fun way of testing underlying behaviors and then saying to financial planners, there's your segmentation. There is a group of people who have similar behavioral propensities, and of your 150, there's only 7 people in that group. But see this group here, there's 38 people. These are the people, when the stock market drops by $5 trillion, you don't need to be on the phone to them. You need to be in front of their faces, putting your arms around their shoulders and saying, the world is fine, don't worry, because these people are in meltdown mode behaviorally. So the answer again, Phil, again, long way around about saying is that, you know, currently there aren't any scientific valid tools out there to do it. And it's what we have spent the last 5 years building for financial planners and their clients.
Okay. And if people want to understand more about the tools that you built, what's the best thing for them to do?
They can look on our website, but if they want to know more detailed information, I am very, very happy for people who are on this webinar to just contact me directly, and I'll send them some information. So it's just Neil, Neil @BIQ, which is BEIQ.com. So just drop me an email, and I'll come back to people with information.
Cool. And when we send out the slides and the recording from this webinar, Neil, is it okay if we just put your contact details in there?
Absolutely is.
Yeah, cool. So 2 questions that have come in. Dan, one from you, or one from Ian, I should say.
Yeah, so Ian's asked a great question. What's confirmation bias?
Confirmation, great question, Ian. So confirmation bias is where you have a view or an opinion, and when you seek evidence, you only seek evidence that supports your view, whilst at exactly the same time ignoring any evidence that could prove that you're wrong. So in other words, we look at the world through blinkers, and if I have a view that global warming isn't a thing, as an example, I don't, by the way, but if I had an opinion that global warming wasn't a thing, I can very quickly find evidence that says that I'm right, even though to my left and right, there is an abundance of evidence that's telling me that I'm wrong. So confirmation bias is where we are biased to finding information that only confirms my view or my opinions. And I tell you, with what's going on in the world at the moment, I don't think we've even seen yet, because information hasn't flowed enough on this subject. I don't think we've seen yet confirmation bias kick in with your clients based on the fact that the bull market of the last 10 years has probably ended. You know, people will still find information around them that will say, no, we're still in a rising market. This is just a blip. So confirmation bias is quite powerful, because people will come to you with all sorts of formed views. And if you have really strong confirmation bias, you need to work doubly hard at breaking down the barriers and allowing them to see both sides or all sides of a story.
And any tips from you, Neil, in terms of breaking down those barriers, how financial planners can break those barriers down?
Well, one is understanding that this bias exists, and number 2 is understanding the strength of that bias. So I don't need to break barriers down with someone who has a weaker confirmation bias than someone who has a stronger confirmation bias. But actually, there's 2 things there, Phil. One is understanding what triggers the behavioral bias in the first place. So what could trigger their confirmation bias? And the second one is using questioning techniques that kind of make sure that clients understand that this bias is a play, but without being judgmental. That's a real trick, by the way. So let me give you an example. Take another behavioral bias of probability neglect, which is very, very present at the moment in the world. Probability neglect is where we as the name suggests, we take statistics and we take data and we don't process the probability, the chance of this thing really happening. It's why people get in a car and drive and think it's safe, but feel that flying is dangerous. That's neglecting probability. Now, if I know that a client has a really strong probability neglect, in other words, they always blow statistical data out of proportion, or they don't really understand it, then when they come and sit in my office and talk to me about their financial plan, I can't talk to them in a language using percentages and probabilities and chance, as opposed to as I would if somebody was sat in the room who had low probability neglect, because they understand that, getting in a car is more dangerous than flying in a plane, whereas the other person sees the world in a completely different way. So there are techniques you can employ where you don't necessarily ask questions, but you start to pry and dig and peel the onion back, I guess, to get to the root cause of what triggered the behavior in the first place, and then weave questions in that makes them see that the response that they are currently giving you is based off a biased position. And again, the software that we've developed, by the way, helps people do this. We give people tips and tricks of how to and questions that they can ask clients in relation to behavioral bias. But just asking these questions, Phil, just is a great start.
Yeah, it's fascinating for me because this stuff is fascinating anyway from a theoretical perspective, but it becomes really powerful when financial planners can implement the practical nature of them in their day-to-day work. The practical application is so important.
Do you know what? You said something in your opening which which kind of landed really well with me. Let me give you an example. Just imagine, right? You've got a client who is sitting at home and is panicking. The markets are falling, blah, blah, blah. And they are really loss averse. In other words, they might think that they're, from an attitude to risk perspective, that they're medium risk, but actually the reality is that the second they lose anything, they panic. Imagine that client is sitting at home, kind of quietly mulling what's going on in the world and sitting there thinking, oh my God, look at the markets falling. I wonder if that's going to impact my financial plan. And the phone rings and it's their financial planner telling them that they know that they're sitting at home mulling about these things and not to worry. The kind of the brownie points that get scored through things like that. I know this as because this has happened to me. Somebody saying something to me when I kind of go, how did you even know that? How did you know that I'm sitting on my couch at home worried about things? So this behavioral insight for me absolutely cements the human to human bonds that clients have with their financial planner. It says, I know you and I hear you and I understand what you're going through and I'm here for you. And without this deep behavioral insight, I don't think you can do that.
Absolutely. It completely comes back to what we were saying earlier, as you said, of that I was thinking of you messages.
Yes, that's right.
And just so powerful. Dan, another question.
Yeah, so we've got a question from Caroline, and this goes back to the segmentation you were referring to earlier. Caroline asks, do you think this segmentation links to attitude to risk and investment experience? And if so, how much?
So the answer, sorry, who was that? Caroline, did you say?
Yes.
Caroline, this is a really great question. So within the BIQ system, we offer an attitude to risk test, 10 questions, psychometric, as you would expect. What's interesting, however, is this. When you look at the behavioral propensities of clients based on risk taking that fall outside of an attitude to risk, so things like loss aversion, things like their present bias, those two behaviors are absolutely linked to risk taking. When you look at a person, just look at loss aversion versus attitude to risk, there is about 26% of the UK population where the gap between those two is really quite wide. In other words, what they think of themselves through their attitude to risk and how they behave are completely opposing. And this goes back to something I said earlier about the way we see the world. We see the world either through a subjective lens, but there is an objective reality that wraps around that. So think of the attitude to risk as the subjective measure and the behavioral test as their objective measure. There's often a gap between the two. So what we do is we push the ATR to the side because it's subjective, but when we do our segmentation, it is based wholly on objective behavioral measures. because the ATR actually, what it tends to do is it tends to muddy the waters. It tends to create it's an input that can give a false output. So we push the ATR to the side, we factor that in, because one of the things that we do is a behavioral risk score, which is based on 3 measures, not just one, which takes into account who they are and who they think they are, and then we give a specific score off the back of that. But the ATR as an individual module sits on the side. It informs our insights, of course it does, but it doesn't form part of our segmentation because it can cloud it can cloud the picture that the behavioral tests are giving us through the segmentation model. There was another part of that question, sorry. What was the other part?
So the first part of the question was, does it? And the second part was, if yes, how much?
Oh, there you go. I've answered that.
Fine. Right, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to ask you my last question, if that's okay, Neil.
Of course.
What are the dangers of getting this wrong? And what are the payoffs for the firm and their clients of getting it right?
Well, I think that, so let's take the second part first, which is what's the payoffs of getting it right. I think I hope I've kind of alluded to some of them as I've gone along. But for me, you know, for me, financial planning, right? And this is only my opinion here. So I'm not stating this as fact. I'm just stating this as Neil's opinion. For me, financial planning is a innately human-to-human relationship business. Everything else, picking funds, you know, looking at fund prices, building a financial plan, cash flow modeling, it's technology driven, which therefore means it can be, you know, sorry to use this word, but it's commoditized. You know, anybody can produce that. That's what the robo advisors are trying to do. But what they can't do is the thing that actually people really hold dear to themselves, which is the human to human relationship. So that we should always capitalize on. And having an understanding of who the person is sitting in front of you at a deeper unconscious level, as well as the conscious level, can only bring about benefit. I can't see any downside to understanding what's going on inside your clients' heads and using that insight at the right time to drive the right outcomes. I really can't. But if you get it wrong, going back to the first part of the question, I think the impact can be really quite profound, because what you have then, without having any insight into how the client thinks or feels, is a client who kind of potentially pays you lip service and says, yes, everything's fine. But deep down inside, they're in absolute utter turmoil. And this goes completely in the face of financial well-being. It couldn't be further away from financial well-being, because whilst we think subjectively the client is fine, and you know, they sat in my room and I showed them the plan and everything was signed off, and they left the room, they shook my hand, and yeah, everything was cool. But actually they walked out thinking, oh my God, this is terrifying. Then missing that part of the jigsaw puzzle, I think puts us on a rocky road. And again, these are just my views of human to human relationships. So I think getting it wrong and not having insight can leave some significant gaps in our knowledge of who we believe the client, or who we know the client to be. Having insight into who they are and how they think and how they feel and how they react, as well as everything else that you gather, can only have upside for me.
And I just love that story of someone sitting on their sofa, watching the news, the phone ringing, and it's their planner at the end.
Yeah, it's massively powerful.
I think that's so powerful. Neil, I want to thank you for your time today. You've been fantastic, and I think everyone has got a massive amount out of this. If anyone wants to send any last questions, send them across now. Dan will have one last look through them. But what I want to do is always keen to leave people with next steps, things that they should be doing next to improve their business. And for me, the first thing is to carry out an evidence-led review of your newsletter proposition, which is, of course, the foundation. The content of the newsletter is the foundation for these touch points with clients. Use your system to be looking at open rates, click-through rates. What are people engaging with? What aren't people engaging with? Look at it on an individual granular level before the next meeting with a client. Look at what they've read online. And start talking to them about it. It shows that you've taken an interest in them. Consider how your clients can be segmented using behavioural propensity, as Neil was talking about. And of course, Neil's app will help with that. We'll send some details through in the follow-up communication to this. And then for me, consider which of those other interactions you could use in your business. Some are just things that will pop into your head, but again, even the "I saw this and thought of you" messages, or the "I was thinking about you" messages. You need to get into habits to do it, in my experience. So if you can get into the habit of doing that, fantastic. And if you can build other processes around birthdays, Christmases, big life events, that sort of stuff, that is the sort of thing that dates can be entered on the back office system and can pop out. So you don't need to be remembering them all the time. But as I say, the stuff that Neil was talking about today was absolute gold dust. Hopefully the other stuff has been useful too, and has given you a few reminders of points where you can improve the quality and the number of interactions you have with a client. Dan, have we got any more questions for Neil?
No, nothing. Just a message from Stephanie saying thank you very much. Yeah, no questions left.
Fantastic. Well, Neil, thank you so much for today.
You're very welcome.
Our next webinar is on Wednesday, the 1st of April, when we're going to be talking about how financial planners can demonstrate value, and that's also going to include a debate about whether financial planners should disclose fees online. We've been talking about it a lot. We thought we'd bring it up in a debate, and I'm hoping we have a very special guest on that day who has got some pretty strident opinions about that as well. So, Neil, once again, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. We'll be sending the follow-up out later on today to everybody, and wish you well for the rest of the day.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care,
Cheers.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.